The idea of an elected presidency with custodial powers was first suggested in 1984.
As the Constitution now stands, if there is a freak election result, all the reserves are available. The larder is wide open. You can raid it.
Changes to the Constitution would give the president powers to safeguard past reserves. The first presidential election was in 1993. The winner, Ong Teng Cheong. In 2008, the first test of the president's custodial powers with the global financial crisis. S.R. Nathan's approval was sought to draw on past reserves. Halimah Yacob would be the first president to unlock past reserves more than once to tide the country over a global pandemic. The president travels the world, strengthening Singapore's ties abroad at the highest level. And at home, the president is a unifying force for the community. The evolution and impact of Singapore's elected presidency 3 decades on.
And that I will bear
true faith and allegiance to the Republic.
And that I will preserve,
protect and defend the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore.
The position of the president is as old as the Republic of Singapore itself. Yusof Ishak became Singapore's first president at independence on 9th August 1965.
Kita boleh bergembira dengan kemajuan yang sentiasa kita capai.
That office replaced the role of Yang di-Pertua Negara or head of state he held when Singapore achieved internal self-government in 1959. The president is Singapore's head of state, representing Singapore at state events and on the global stage. The president is not the head of government. Parliament appointed Benjamin Sheares as president in 1971 after the death of Yusof Ishak. Sheares was followed by Devan Nair in 1981. Nair by Wee Kim Wee.
I, Wee Kim Wee,
as presidents, their roles were ceremonial and symbolic. But major changes were coming. In 1984, then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew broached the idea of an elected president with broader responsibilities.
As the Constitution now stands, if there is a freak election result and a coalition forms the government, all the reserves are available. The larder is wide open. You can raid it. 25 years' work. Savings. You can go on a spending spree for 5 years, and then we are another broken back country. So we've thought out some blocking mechanisms so that no government can spend previously built up reserves. I think the president has to be elected by the people, direct vote, not in parliament. So he also has moral authority. Preferably, he should be an ex-minister with understanding of how governments and budgets are run.
In 1988, Deputy Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong presented the first white paper on an elected presidency in Parliament.
The president will not be an executive president. He will only have a custodial role in 2 areas: safeguarding of our financial reserves and of the integrity of the public service.
The debate will comprise essentially of 3 parts.
The proposal was explained and debated.
We have not done that.
I still stand by it.
It is a 2-key safeguard mechanism. To unlock the reserves and take out the money, both keys must be used. The Prime Minister and his cabinet hold one key and the President the other.
Our purpose is very simple. Safeguard CPF savings, prevent an unscrupulous government from squandering them without telling you or consulting you.
Opposing the principle, but you are...
The President can also veto appointments to key public offices. In 1990, a second white paper added 3 more safeguard roles over internal security, religious harmony, and corrupt practices. On 3rd January 1991, the bill was passed into law, turning the presidency into a directly elected office. The elected president now had constitutional duties as well as ceremonial and community duties for a 6-year term. Incumbent President Wee Kim Wee was the first to be vested with the new constitutional powers. Under the Constitution, the elected president has discretionary powers and non-discretionary powers. Non-discretionary powers, such as granting an offender clemency and the appointment of ministers, must be exercised on the Cabinet's advice. With discretionary powers, the President can veto or block certain government actions in areas including the use of past reserves, budgets or transactions by the Central Provident Fund Board, and key public appointments and dismissals, but must consult the Council of Presidential Advisers or CPA. It is optional to consult the CPA when the President considers a veto on detention orders under the Internal Security Act and any restraining orders relating to the maintenance of religious harmony. In addition, the President may authorize investigations by the Corrupt Practices Investigations Bureau, even if the Prime Minister does not consent. In 1993, there were 6 members of the Council of Presidential Advisers and 2 alternates. Now, there are 8 plus 2 alternates. 3 are appointed by the President, 3 by the Prime Minister, 1 by the Chief Justice, and 1 by the Chairman of the Public Service Commission.
You've got people from business, you've got people from banking, you've got people from public policy, you've got people from social sector. So we all bring different views to the table.
With President Wee due to step down, Singapore's first presidential election kicked off on Nomination Day, 18 August 1993. In 1993, candidates needed to be at least 45 years old with at least 3 years' experience as a minister, chief justice, attorney general, or other senior public sector roles. Also qualifying, heads of corporations with a paid-up capital of at least $100 million. The Presidential Elections Committee, which assesses if candidates meet the criteria, issued 2 certificates for the 1993 election. One to Ong Teng Cheong, who resigned as Deputy Prime Minister, MP for Toa Payoh GRC, and member of the People's Action Party. The other to Chua Kin Yao, former Accountant General.
Chua Kin Yao, 670,358 votes.
Chua received 41.3% of the vote.
Ong Teng Cheong, 952,513 votes.
Backed by the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister and Labour unions, Ong received 58.7% of the vote. Ong Teng Cheong was sworn in as Singapore's first elected president on 1st September 1993.
Ong Teng Cheong, having been elected President of the Republic of Singapore. We elected a president to safeguard the integrity of the civil service and protect our financial reserves. The elected president will make it harder for government to go on a profligate spending spree and squander our hard-earned reserves.
In 1994, President Ong questioned the government's interpretation of the Constitution when it introduced a bill to revise the scope of the president's veto powers. He asked for the matter to be referred to a special High Court tribunal chaired by the Chief Justice. The tribunal ruled in favor of the government. President Ong accepted the decision. President Ong also wanted to know the extent of the reserves he was mandated to safeguard. He asked for a list of physical assets from the Accountant General on 18 June 1996. 2 months later, on 14 August 1996, he was presented with a list of state buildings and a list of state lands. President Ong remarked that reserves should ideally be denominated in dollar value. The government provided the information he requested in 3 years.
As the elected president, I hold the second key to the spending of the nation's past reserves. But I can only act on knowledge. I can veto proposed spending that is likely to encroach on past reserves only if and when I come to know of such a transaction.
In 1997, President Ong didn't approve the Central Provident Fund Board's budget until he was satisfied that it would not draw on the nation's reserves. President Ong worked with the government on the constitutional powers and workings of the elected presidency, resulting in 2 institutional developments by the end of his term.
I have achieved what I have set out to achieve when I took office 6 years ago. And I'm gratified to see that the white paper on the determination and safeguarding of the protection of the reserve of the government was published and tabled in Parliament on July the 2nd. The lessons that we have gathered in the course of working out or testing out the new system has been incorporated into the white paper, and that gave a better arrangement system for the government and the president to work, to avoid unnecessary conflicts and misunderstanding.
A tribunal of judges for constitutional disputes was also created. The presidential elections scheduled in 1999 and 2005 were walkovers for S.R. Nathan. In 2011, Tony Tan won the election in a 4-way fight. The elected presidency continued to evolve. The 2017 election saw a reserved election for the first time and more stringent criteria.
Since the elected presidency began, I've been operating the mechanism that we designed and discovering its glitches. I helped to refine and amend the scheme as we went along. So I think I can say that I know the system. What the design intent was when we first formulated the scheme, how it has worked in practice, how conditions have changed, how our ideas have evolved, and how we should fine-tune and improve the scheme to make it work for our long-term future.
The 2017 election was reserved for candidates from the Malay community. Since President Yusof Ishak served from 1965 to 1970, there had been no president from the Malay community. Under constitutional amendment, the presidential election will now be reserved for a community if no one from that community has held the office of president for any of the 5 most recent terms. There were also more stringent criteria. A chairman or CEO would need to manage a company with at least $500 million in shareholder equity for the most recent 3-year period of service. The Elections Department declared former Speaker of Parliament, Halimah Yacob, the only eligible candidate in 2017. she became the 8th President of Singapore and the first female president in Singapore's history.
Madam President-elect.
A major test of the elected presidency. Just ahead, we look at how the president safeguards the reserves in times of crisis. President Ong Teng Cheong would test the custodial powers of the office of the elected presidency. Since its introduction in 1991, constitutional amendments were made to refine the institution's role and powers. But it would be President S.R. Nathan who would be faced with a request for a drawdown on Singapore's past reserves for the very first time. During his second term in office, President Nathan talked about improving the details of the custodial function of the office.
With this custodial function of the elected presidency is now well established, the detailed rules and procedures to operationalize the concept will have to be worked out progressively. And from time to time, these working arrangements will have to be refined due to changing circumstances.
4 years later, the government would seek President Nathan's approval for a drawdown on past reserves as Singapore battled the spread of a financial crisis. In September 2008, American investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed, triggered by the subprime mortgage crisis.
It's not good. It sucks.
It was the largest US bankruptcy at the time. By October, the crisis spread and Singapore was not spared. About 10,000 investors in Singapore lost a total of over $500 million in financial products linked to Lehman Brothers. Many retirees who saw their savings wiped out clamored for redress from the financial institutions that sold them the risky products. President Nathan and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong discussed the situation behind closed doors.
We reached a point where things were getting very critical, and we asked to be briefed by GIC, by Temasek, by Finance Ministry, by MAS, and the ministers came before me and the CPA to brief us on what they felt was the likely implications for us. So we knew that we were in a state where inevitably we had to do something. What was the something was for government to decide.
In January 2009, the President's approval was sought to draw $4.9 billion from Singapore's past reserves.
It was a pioneering move on the part of the government, the first time that the government had come to the CPA, to the President, to draw on the past reserves. So naturally we paid a little attention.
The challenge was, do we do it or don't we do it? We do it, there is a risk we are taking. We don't do it, there's an even bigger risk we are taking. So that's the judgment call.
When the government seeks the President's approval for any drawdown on past reserves, the President must consult the Council of Presidential Advisors, or the CPA. The CPA convenes and makes its recommendations to the President, who then makes a decision on the request. If the President agrees, he approves the request in writing. The President has a 30-day time limit to exercise a veto. If the President disagrees with the proposal and exercises a veto against the CPA's advice, Parliament can choose to overrule the President. A motion to overrule the President must be supported by at least 2/3 of all the members of Parliament.
We looked at the proposals of the Ministry of Finance. We found that they were eminently reasonable. So there was no major problem. We had to clarify certain points on the technical aspects of the the assessment and the draw on the reserves, but there was no problem with the basic approach of the government.
After 11 days of deliberation, President Nathan exercised the chief function of the elected presidency by turning the second key to the national reserves. On 22nd January 2009, the Minister for Finance announced details of the resilience package.
Our key objective in this package is to help Singaporeans keep their jobs. The government has sought the President's approval to draw on past reserves to fund these two measures now, rather than wait till we exhaust the savings of the current government. The President has given his in-principle approval for this draw of 4.9 billion from past reserves. The first and most important...
This was also the first draw on past reserves since the constitutional framework for protection of reserves was instituted in 1991. The government also asked for a $150 billion guarantee on all bank deposits in Singapore to be backed by past reserves.
I think a system was tested. It responded to the urgency of the system. I think we all in good conscience can say that we responded after clinically examining the proposal. We couldn't dispute on the circumstances. As to whether their proposals were right or wrong, we don't micromanage government. And it's for the government in power to determine what is to be done. As you know, I'm not an executive president. The executive is really the government. It's for them to find solutions to our nation's problems and come up with proposals.
He understood very well the formal powers that he had as the president, holding the second key, the custodial functions of the president. So he approached it in a very practical way, and I would say in a very wise way as well.
The actual amount drawn from the reserves was $4 billion, which was put back in full in 2011. The deposit guarantee scheme expired on 31st December 2010 without being triggered.
The result was we were able to stabilize the economy, to boost confidence and to recover strongly when the storm passed. But also importantly, we were able to demonstrate how the presidential safeguards were meant to work and could work in a tight situation.
11 years later, President Halimah Yacob would be the second president to exercise the discretionary powers as Singapore faced a global shutdown triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Faced with an unprecedented and evolving situation, the government set aside over $100 billion across 5 budgets in 2020 to support workers, businesses, households, and individuals through the pandemic. The government sought President Halimah's approval to draw from past reserves up to $52 billion that year.
I'm very clear in my mind. I'm only authorized to release past reserves for exceptional, very exceptional circumstances. So both the CPA and myself, we have to, when the Minister for Finance comes to us, when the government comes to us specifically, more specifically, to say that we need these reserves to do these programs, then first we have to ascertain whether this comes within the confines of my powers. That is, this is very exceptional circumstances. Then we go to the next question, and that is how much of the past reserves should we allow the government to draw down? Now that is a very intense process. That is for the government then to justify. To say we need this amount, these billions of dollars for these purposes and this program. And the programs are then all itemized. We need this for vaccine, we need this for building additional facilities, for ensuring that the front line, especially healthcare workers, are protected, protective gears and so on. So I think once they provide that, then we understand better the situation, then we can talk about whether we want to support the government's request to draw down the past reserves.
President Halimah approved drawdowns from past reserves of $11 billion in 2021 and $6 billion in 2022.
It's also a learning moment for all of us that we were fortunate, we had very good governance, and we had a very good reserves base where we could use it in order to take care of the needs of Singaporeans.
The face of Singapore to the world. How the President represents Singapore's interests abroad. As head of state, the President represents Singapore at home and abroad. The role includes going on state visits and hosting foreign dignitaries to strengthen bilateral relations.
In projecting our profile abroad, in winning friends for ourselves, in conveying our messages, the most senior person in the Singapore team is the President.
A meeting between countries at the head of state level takes place only upon formal invitation by the host. It is the highest form of diplomatic exchange and also the most elaborate. In 2014, ahead of Singapore's Golden Jubilee, President Tony Tan made the first ever state visit to the United Kingdom by a Singapore president. From state dinners to gift exchanges, the president receives honor on behalf of Singapore and an invitation to address top executives of the land.
We are friends in all weather, whether it is British weather or Singapore weather. In a state visit, there are many elements. There's a ceremonial element.
Register. No, sir. Spread.
But more important than that are the substantive meetings which I have with the heads of state, heads of government, and the ministers, where we go down to the actual issues of concern between Singapore and these countries.
In 2016, President Tan made Singapore's first state visits to Italy and Vatican City. That year, he was also the first Singapore president to visit Latin America. He was in Mexico to celebrate 40 years of Singapore-Mexico bilateral relations since 1975. In 2017, President Tan made another first head of state visit to Poland. His state visits strengthened Singapore's economic links and scientific exchanges with Poland and the Czech Republic.
If our president goes to another country and we happen to have one request that we want to make to this country, the foreign minister will make it, the prime minister will reinforce it, and the person that has the heaviest weight, or persuasive power will be the president. So the president can help advance our diplomatic agenda. This is why all presidents make state visits abroad.
During his 2 terms as president, S.R. Nathan traveled widely to maintain relationships and forge new ones. A former diplomat, he was known to many heads of state. From the start of his presidency, he kept close ties with immediate neighbors, making a point to connect when new leaders took over.
Our strong bonds are underpinned by mutual respect and understanding. On this, your first visit to Singapore as President of the Republic of Indonesia, we want to reassure you, Ibu President, of our continued friendship and of our support.
In 12 years, President Nathan hosted 50 heads of state and over 100 prime ministers and important delegations on official visits to Singapore. He visited around 30 countries, including 8 ASEAN capitals. On his first state visit as president, he visited the Republic of Vietnam and affirmed Singapore's commitment to ASEAN integration. Many of his visits were the first by a Singapore president.
Persevere with economic reform.
In 2003, he made the first state visit to Cambodia by a Singapore president.
I bring with me the warm wishes of all Singaporeans and the government and people of Singapore to their Cambodian compatriots and friends. My visit is also a strong affirmation of Singapore's commitment to friendly and cooperative ties with Cambodia.
In 2005, President Nathan visited Thailand in a first state visit by a Singapore president. The visit marked 40 years of diplomatic relations between Singapore and Thailand. This state visit was only weeks after the Indian Ocean tsunami hit the coasts of Thailand. President Nathan made an unscheduled visit to Phuket to take part in a Buddhist ceremony for the victims of the tsunami.
I decided to break journey and stop here in Phuket, primarily to attend this religious ceremony and pay my respects to those who have passed away, and also my prayers for those who are missing.
Beyond Southeast Asia, President Nathan worked to establish diplomatic ties near and far. His meetings with counterparts from China, India, and the United States affirmed economic cooperation between Singapore and these countries.
The President of Singapore is not empowered to pursue her or his independent foreign policy. This is an area in which she has no power. She has to follow the foreign policy of the government.
In 2006, the Japanese emperor visited Singapore, marking 40 years of diplomatic ties. In 2009, President Nathan made the first state visit to Japan by a Singapore president. He was the first head of state to meet and interact with survivors of the Hiroshima atomic bombings in 1945. President Nathan was also the first Singapore president to visit South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana in 2007, where he brought a delegation of businessmen. On the state level, Singapore pledged to share with South Africa and Namibia its experience in administration and skills training.
We have to take their earnestness in wanting to learn from us seriously, and we try what we can to help them.
The president's diplomatic role includes receiving foreign ambassadors when they present their credentials on arrival to Singapore. The president also endorses all of Singapore's ambassadors to foreign countries before they leave for their mission. President Halimah Yacob is the first female president of Singapore.
By being the face of Singapore to the world, for example, if your president is a female, as is the case now, this is a minority in the world, no? Only a minority of countries have a female head of state. And if the head of state is also from a minority race, this makes the person also, more unique to the world. So, and represent to the world that Singapore is a multiracial, multi-religious country, that we are pro-gender, equality, and our head of state is a woman. So sometimes just a person alone convey many messages.
During her 6-year term, President Halimah received calls by 47 heads of state and government. She made 12 state visits abroad. In 2019, she made Singapore's first state visit to Saudi Arabia and was conferred the King Abdulaziz Medal, Saudi Arabia's highest civilian honor. She was also the first Singapore head of state to visit Central Asia in May 2023.
When I meet leaders, foreign leaders here, heads of state, the purpose is to strengthen bilateral relations, of course, and also to, at the same time, explore opportunities for economic activities, new initiatives, especially in the new areas that are important to us, such as renewables, such as, sustainable development, digitalization, and so on. So we also make sure that we develop stronger relations with like-minded partners, particularly in a situation where there are a lot of geopolitical tensions.
In June 2023, President Halimah made her last state visit as President of Singapore to Qatar, where she was given a very special escort to her meetings with the Emir.
The Emir of Qatar went out of his way to show his warmth towards our president and arrange for a guard of honor that included camels, horses, So sometimes the choreography indicate to you, the warmth and goodwill that the receiving state shows you,
Singapore's presidents take up the challenge to make Singapore a more caring, united society. That's still to come.
Nearly a quarter of Singapore's population has been rehoused in these smart
Singapore, after the separation from Malaysia in 1965.
Since 1960, has just moved.
There was uncertainty about the path forward for the nation. Singapore's first president, Yusof Ishak, was a unifying figure.
It would be the first time in our history that the contingents...
It is the president's duty to unite the nation regardless of social class, race, language, or religion. When President Halimah Yacob took office in 2017, her aim was to help create a more inclusive, caring, and compassionate society.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for supporting President's Star Charity.
The President's Star Charity Show was an established avenue to rally Singaporeans.
Raise awareness and funds for the President's Challenge.
It doesn't really matter how much you contribute. Most important is that it comes from the heart. I really look forward to working very closely with everyone for many more years to come, so that truly we can together help to build an inclusive and caring society. Thank you very much.
The annual TV fundraiser combines the star power of local and international celebrities with the heft of the president's title. In 1993, it was President Ong Teng Cheong's vision to mobilize more people to do their part for society. The show was created to raise funds and create public awareness for the less fortunate. Beneficiaries ranged from homes for the aged to children's homes and even arts groups selected annually by the president himself. In 1994, the first show was broadcast in Mandarin on the local Chinese channel. The event raised over $800,000. More artists chipped in for the second edition in 1996, which included simultaneous translation by English-speaking hosts.
Ramakrishna Boys Home.
Doing Home for Senior Citizens for charity.
Because the president is a president for not just the Chinese community, but for Singapore by and large. And so naturally, and it should be, on a platform where it can reach out to a wider community.
Remember, any amount will go a long, long way.
The shows turned into a more English-based show with the inclusion with a lot more different celebrities represented by different communities, different races.
A compassionate society was the national identity President S.R. Nathan envisioned for Singapore when he took office in the year 2000. He launched the President's Challenge, partnering the National Council of Social Service and the Ministry of Community Development, Youth and Sports. His aim was to get more Singaporeans involved in contributing to charity. The President's Challenge consolidated all the charity projects into a single platform for different sectors like businesses, schools, and individuals to contribute. Beneficiaries were selected by the President on an annual basis.
I see the President's Challenge as not merely a fundraising effort. It is really about engaging Singaporeans from all walks of life in charitable acts of caring and expressing support for the less fortunate in our midst.
So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Mr. President.
The annual President's Star Charity Show now came under the President's Challenge. And among the many performers, President Nathan also took to the stage to encourage donations.
Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons.
To date, the President's Challenge has raised over $170 million and rallied scores of volunteers.
On one level, there has been certainly more funds raised for the causes supported by the President's Challenge. Importantly, I think also sparking more volunteerism in terms of understanding what the needs are in society and having more advocacy, having more support generally among different groups, among employers. I think that's definitely been a benefit of President's Challenge.
President Tony Tan sought to promote a more active civil society. He felt that Singapore needed to build up its social reserves to complement the substantial financial reserves that had been accumulated. Dr. Tan expanded the Singapore's President's Challenge charity event to go beyond fundraising.
Our financial reserves are like the piggy bank of a family, and the social reserves are the bonds which unite the family. The social reserves of a nation are the intangible ties that bind us to one another and which make a nation greater than the sum of its individual citizens. Social reserves are the goodwill that make us look out for one another, particularly during difficult times. They are the resilience help us to overcome challenges and constraints, and give us the tenacity to progress both as individuals and as a nation.
Dr. Tan urged Singaporeans to volunteer and support social enterprises. He started 2 initiatives, the President's Challenge Volunteer Drive and the President's Challenge Social Enterprise Award. These initiatives encouraged people to go beyond monetary donations and rely on skills and talent to help the less fortunate. In 2015, he launched the President's Challenge Silver Volunteer Fund, which encourages seniors to volunteer their time.
Do you know who the President of Singapore is?
I forgot his name.
I forgot his name.
And joining them are the kids.
In 2018, the President's Challenge took on a new direction under President Halimah. She announced the Empowering for Life Fund, a fund supporting vulnerable groups. A sum of $10 million was set aside to help disadvantaged individuals and low-income families through programs for skills upgrading and employment.
As we talk about skills future and lifelong learning as a nation, it is perhaps even more critical that we support those who are less fortunate to upgrade their skills, so that they too have fair opportunities to secure employment.
President Halimah wanted the office of the president to be closer to the people. To make the Istana more accessible to the public, she introduced new events like picnics, garden tours, and even welcomed volunteer gardeners on Istana grounds.
For instance, the picnic at the Istana program, we bring in children from disadvantaged homes working with family service centers. They come, they have a picnic. Then I have the visit the gardens, Istana Gardens visits, where we have even groups like the motor neuron disease. They came, and so these are things that give me that satisfaction. So if I have succeeded in actually making people look at the presidency as not something that's distant, not attached to people, but at least as one that's more engaged, close to the people, I think that would be something that I would be very happy about.
Believe was the title of the theme song for the President's Star Charity 2021. President Halimah and her husband, Mr. Muhammad Abdullah Al-Habshi, put in hours of hard work practicing Singapore Sign Language to ensure a smooth performance.
Whatever I had tried to achieve in trying to create a more compassionate, caring society, I hope that will continue. Humanity is all about caring for each other, supporting each other, be kinder with each other.